What does it look
Mm,
like to be there for your children, to sacrifice for your children if you didn't have that, right? So
mm,
you have this model that was broken, and then you may want to do better, right? But then you don't really have a template for how to do better, how to
mm.
be a better mother.
This is the Bad Mothers Podcast, where we dive deep into our maternal urges or lack thereof. We talk about the mothers we left or who left us, and whether they haunt our own choices about having children. This week is often the start of a difficult time of year for a lot of estranged people, and I hope this interview with Dr. Bridgette J. Peteet is helpful. She's a clinical psychologist, professor, and author of Dishonor Thy Mother: Daughterhood, Dysfunction, and Deliverance. This hybrid memoir blends personal truth with psychological insight. Her work centers on adverse childhood experiences, cultural identity, and resilience, drawing from nearly 2 decades of community-engaged health disparities research. Her writing invites readers to confront difficult family narratives while reclaiming healing, power, and possibility. I'm so pleased to share this conversation with Dr. Peteet, who brings her own experiences and anecdotes, but even better, professional advice and information for women in difficult or impossible relationships with their mothers, and who are working hard to overcome those demons. I found her to be an enlightened and validating voice in a space often filled with turmoil. I hope you enjoy. Your new book is out now, Dishonor Thy Mother.
Mhm.
And in it, you address different types of abuse that you've seen in your practice and that you've experienced yourself. Um,
Yes.
and they're called adverse childhood experiences, or ACE. Can you briefly explain what that means and the impact you see that kind of abuse having on people in adulthood?
Mhm. So, adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are a series of 10 events that occur before the age of 18 that we know have a severe impact on adulthood in terms of health and mental health. So, that can include a range of incidents like emotional abuse and neglect, physical abuse, incarcerated family member, parent who uses substances, and so forth. Now, ACEs have been expanded in a lot of ways recently to include other things that we know also have a detrimental impact on adults, but the traditional measure looked at these incidents and determined that they were sort of the strongest predictors of adulthood challenges. So most of us have ACEs, so it's not like this, super rare thing. Unfortunately, about 60% of adults have experienced at least one childhood adversity, with the most common being parents separating or divorcing. So
Mm,
that's a fairly common one. And with ACEs, it's not to say that, all ACEs are created equally. So obviously, physical abuse probably has a little bit more potential impact than, say, emotional neglect. But we know that overall, these types of things can really, impact how we think, our future relationships, our mental health, and even our physical health, and those associated behaviors that we might use to cope with them. And so what I find in my work is that people, one, almost normalize these childhood traumas as if they were just, a standard part of, what we experienced growing up. And they don't
mm,
necessarily realize that it was a trauma, or how it
mm,
has affected them. So in my book, I kind of take a little bit of a different approach, because I think in the discourse on ACEs, we're often talking about what has happened to a person and, the systemic things that contribute to it, which is great. We can't deny the effects of the social structures that, impact individuals and their environments. But, when we really look at ACEs, there is a lot of activities that are within the parental purview, right? So, I tell people are coming to see me in therapy. They're not thinking, oh, this is because of poverty or this is because of lack of access to healthcare, right? It's really about those interpersonal relationships that they struggled with in childhood that they continue to struggle with, in particular their parent. So that's sort of
Mm-hmm.
the unique angle of my work.
Hmm. What kind of issues do you see people grappling with as a result of these ACEs? So like I know just in the people that I've spoken to, and I don't know if what they've experienced would qualify, but a lot of women have told me about like difficulty in romantic relationships, concerns around motherhood, and
Oh,
like what,
absolutely.
yeah, okay. Well, I'll let you carry on. Go
No,
on.
absolutely. So first, when I first kind of started looking at ACEs, it was really the physical health. So, this came from of course, physical health gets attention first, right? So
Hmm.
folks with high blood pressure, hypertension, health behaviors like smoking and substance use, of course, if you're in environments where, substance use is happening, you're of course more likely to engage in substance use. But then, of course, as a psychologist, I'm more interested in the mental health side. And so,
Hmm.
just basic standard things that we might see like depression, anxiety, and so forth. But I love what you mentioned about the interpersonal part because I think that's the thing where people probably more easily associate with the relationships in childhood kind of mirroring what's happening in their adult relationships. So having trouble connecting with others, sort of low emotional immaturity, those partner issues, right? But then also there's sort of a challenge in then rearing your own kids, which is I think probably even more important if I dare say, because you haven't really been shown how to provide emotional support. What does it look
Hmm.
like to be there for your children, to sacrifice for your children if you didn't have that, right? So
Hmm.
you have this model that was broken and then you may want to do better, right, but then you don't really have a template for how to do better, how to be
Hmm.
a better mother. So I find that a lot of folks maybe avoid having children,
Hmm.
or they may really just be an anxious parent because they feel like they're going to make mistakes. And then
Hmm.
there's those that kind of fall into the same patterns because that's what we naturally do. We model what we
Hmm.
saw. So they may not even realize that these patterns were toxic because, again, it's so normalized, from birth that they don't
Hmm.
realize that, there's anything necessarily wrong. So a lot of times you'll see those in family situations where the child is sort of that's seen as the primary problem in the family. But then when you investigate further, you see that a lot of other things are going on, that the child is kind of the symptom and not really the source of the
Hmm.
strife. So but the biggest thing for me, I think, is women who are still struggling in relations with their adult mothers. So whether it's parenting them if they're in old age, whether it's just having boundaries with them now as they enter adulthood,
Hmm.
that it becomes very frustrating to recognize what's happened in the relationship and then to sort of feel that sense of helplessness maybe you felt as a child and not be able to effectively engage with your adult mother, because they don't have that sense of boundaries. There's hierarchies in the relationship. There's cultural pressures or respect and
Hmm.
religious pressures, like I talk about in the book, like honoring your parents. And so a lot of times people say, oh, let it go, it was in your childhood, it was in your past. But what I find is that it really is a pattern that can continue into adulthood if it's not broken,
Hmm.
right? So, you're kind of engaging in the same way, in the same toxic way that the parent was engaging when you were a child. So it doesn't really end.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
I find a lot of women struggling with that because they want to respect their mother, they want to, honor her, but at the same time, it's causing all of these emotional challenges for them. It's adding an extra burden, even as they try to maybe even try to parent better. It makes it more difficult.
Hmm. Um, so there's a lot I want to ask you about in that. I'm trying to order my thoughts, but I'm thinking about a conversation I had as part of this podcast a couple weeks ago with Gail Kirschenbaum, who her story is more about how she overcame the problems in her relationship with her mom, and they're very close now.
Mhm.
Um, and her, my takeaway from her experience was that she learned to see her mom as more a victim of her own upbringing and to basically find a way to feel sympathy for her rather than angry at her for the way her mom treated her. Um, but I haven't been able to frame my experience that way, and I know a lot of women that I have spoken to can't do that. And we know
Absolutely.
that, abusers usually have their own beasts, their own terrible experiences that have like made them behave the way they do toward their kids.
Mhm.
So how do we frame these things? How much can we be expected to overlook or ignore or forgive?
Mhm.
Um, because we know, they maybe deserve some sympathy, but at the same time we're suffering. So how do
Yeah.
you think we should pick those things apart?
I think it's a range. I
Mm,
don't I don't think there's one right answer. I think ideally, based on our, societal pressures, family pressures, our own individual guilt, that is a nice way to look at it, right? Like
mm,
they have their own experiences and that has shaped who they are. But then I think there's a part of how much does the parent have the capacity to reflect, change, and to stop wounding you, right?
mhm,
So to stay in relation with somebody who is going to continue emotionally harming you, I would say is not healthy. So understanding is great, empathy is great, but it only takes us so far. And I think it's part of our tendency as a society to want this redemption arc for everyone. Like, well,
mhm,
it has to be this. We have to explain this. This doesn't make sense. Why would a mother treat her child this way? And so we try to reframe it. We try to account for, well, these behaviors must have caused them to act that way because otherwise all things considered they would have been a great mother.
mhm,
So I don't know that it's possible with everyone. I do think that again, you have to see like how much it's affecting you. Because I'll take my grandmother as an example, who was in relationship with my mother as well, and they had a very toxic relationship. But it wasn't my grandmother was sort of the victim in the same way that I was. Like my mother just really because of her personality you were either her friend or foe, right? There's
mhm,
no in between. So anytime you try to address the behavior, you are seen as the enemy. So, my mother sort of crafted this narrative that my grandmother was this monster because it didn't really fit with her outcomes, right? So whereas
mhm,
everyone else would say, yeah, my grandmother was a bit of a perfectionist, but she was very nurturing. She loved hard. She loved people no matter what, like that unconditional, Christian love for her. She really did, I think, especially coming from her circumstances, try her best to parent her children in a way that was very different. And she sort of turned around, their whole lives. Like she had a similar childhood as me, and none of her children had adverse childhood experiences. So for my mother, then to frame it as this toxic, horrible mother, it's just really to fit that narrative to account for who she is and how she was.
mhm,
Um, and I don't think, I think there's a difference between explaining and accepting behavior. Like, I think you still have the consequences of what happened. It doesn't absolve you from what you did. It doesn't, erase it. The pain still exists. Um, and I think for me, the biggest question is, are they still currently, and I'm not, and I don't mean like you're not going to ever have conflict again, but I do mean when you think about are they actively still the same person? And I think for
mhm,
me, that was the part that I had to really, really accept. My grandmother was in the business of forgiveness. So she's like turn the other cheek and,
mhm.
forgive 7 times 7, 70. And I'm like, my mom is out of chances. Like this is your the time is up. And I think it was really understanding that this is who she is and not an expectation like she can grow or change, or I can try to be her therapist and cure
Mm,
her, and or God, I can pray it away, or I can, like, no, I have to fully accept who she is. Now maybe if I had a higher capacity to stay in that toxic cycle, right,
mm,
over and over again, that abuse cycle, then perhaps we could have stayed in relation longer. But I think, there is no shame in fully accepting them for who they are, and not sort of looking to what their past was as a excuse or validation for how
mm.
they parented.
Yeah, yeah. That makes sense to me. I think maybe in some cases, as you said, different people have different capacity to stay in the relationship, or maybe the type of issues that existed in the relationship aren't as harmful in
Right.
adulthood, maybe. It
Yes,
depends a lot on the circumstances, I guess.
absolutely.
Um, okay, I appreciate your perspective
Yeah.
on that. I've been mulling that over a lot.
It's a
Um,
hard one. Yeah. I
yeah.
mean, you do want to have empathy for that, but I think we take it too far. I think we make a lot of assumptions. I think it's difficult for people to step into the shoes of the people who experienced it and really understand that this is not something that we want to, have distance from them, or, no
Mm,
contact, but this is what we need for our mental health. And that's
mm,
okay. That's just as valid as accepting it and saying, hey, I understand from their past, this is how they are. It's just as valid. And,
mm.
I don't want people to feel any sense of, but I guess it's difficult not to feel guilt because, again, societal pressure, but to
Yeah.
let that go and, understand that, you have to take care of yourself and your own mental health, and you
Mm,
can't cure, heal, and change people.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, as you were saying, and many of the women that I've interviewed for the podcast, they are concerned about, if they have children, about inadvertently adopting their mom's abusive behaviors.
Mhm.
Um, Even though those women have like sought out therapy and other practices to address like the harm they experience and to, see things more clearly. So do you think that having an abusive mother makes it especially difficult to be a quote unquote good mother? Do you think how do we break these cycles?
Mhm.
Because as you said, some people will just carry on without realizing that it is abusive or harmful, and other people become really like nervous
Mhm.
moms because they don't want to repeat behaviors. So what's the best way to approach it so that we are, you
Yeah.
know, moms aren't just overcome with this worry?
Yeah. I remember reading about work. I used to worry like, oh, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm a narcissist. Maybe I'm the problem. My mom would constantly tell me it's you. And, it would kind of be reinforced through the family because I would not accept this behavior.
Mm,
And I remember talking about, if you're here wondering if you're a narcissist, you're probably not.
mm,
I think the same applies to mothers who have been victimized as children. If you're even worrying about being a good mother or not, I think that's
mm,
already the first step. I think then it becomes, how much work are you going to do to try to change the pattern, like change that sort of instinctual thing that has been ingrained in you, as far as like how you respond to your children, right?
mm,
How you engage with them, how you support them, and what that looks like. And I think the challenge sometimes is that people might pick one thing. They might pick one thing that they hated that their mother did, and they're like, well, I'm not going to do that. But they miss a whole host of other things that are still problematic. So you're
mm,
have the pattern, you still have, maybe you're emotionally volatile still, right? But you show up for every single event that they perform in, right? So it's like you're still you're doing a little better. So I don't want to give them, I don't want to deny them any credit, but there are a range of areas that you really have to think about addressing, right? Um, so for me, it's like I am, because of my mother, I'm not particularly affectionate. And then I have a very, very, one of my children is very, very affectionate. So I sort of have to, hold knowing that about myself, and
Mm,
be able to sacrifice my comfort for my child. Now,
mm,
some people will say like, all sacrificing mother, and I'm a person that believes like you're still teaching them. Like other people have, their feelings too, and age
mm,
appropriate, of course. But it's like I have to sacrifice part of my comfort to provide my child with something that they need. That is more than what I would, seek.
mm,
But that will give them what they need because they're growing. I'm the adult, right? So the onus is
mm,
on me to sacrifice myself, right? It's in the moments where you're stressed out that I think a lot of those behaviors will come out. Parenting is very, very stressful. And so, those, I said, call it the witching hour, like after work, before bed, where it's just like everyone's tired and hungry and dirty and needs a
mm,
bath. And it's just chaos and you are not at your best. And so, thinking about for your family, what is that time? And really, what do I need to do to get my mind right? So it's
mm,
like maybe you need to sit in the car for 5 minutes. Maybe you need to go for a walk, when you get home, or you all need to go to the
mm,
park right away, or whatever it is to try to take some of the steam off of, when things are in that intense hour. Because I think
mm,
that, at least for me, and I think for a lot of my clients, that it sort of feels like, oh, I'm at my wit's end, and then I'm trying to parent better, but I don't have much left in the tank, right?
mm, mm,
And so I think, like being aware, for me, I always say I need my frontal lobe to kick in and not my innate, who I am. I need to be able to respond with love and compassion. And that doesn't mean I'm going to do it perfectly all the time, but
mm,
I don't think that's realistic. Like no one's perfect. No one's a perfect parent. I
mm,
just am constantly working on those things. Like, how do I respond in a way that I would have liked my mother to respond? How do I respond in a way that my child seems most receptive to? Right. So even
mm,
beyond like what I think, it's like, what do they need? And paying attention to that. How do they respond? I have a daughter who's very stoic and she can handle being chastised, but the younger one is very sensitive.
mm,
So it's like you kind of have to be calmly walk her through the whys and the consequences, and they're different. So even I can't just apply to what would have worked for me. I have to think about, what do my kids need, right?
mm, mm,
And I think for also the other part is really using your tribe, like your models that you do have that, maybe in your circle, maybe it's your coworkers, your friend, there may be healthy family members that are
mm,
kind of modeling the kind of mothering approach that, inspires you. And I think for me, that helped a lot. So my grandmother was that for me as a primary source. But, women in my circle who just had the infinite patience to like sit and do crafts or play with toys or come up with activities. I'm just like, I don't even know. Like my mother didn't
mm,
play with this. I have no idea what you're supposed to do,
mm,
all day on a snow day with your kids.
mm,
So I think it's like, again, not picking one thing. And I think people do this, if I may just share, like I think they do this in romantic relationships too. I've had clients say, well, at least he doesn't hit me. And I'm like, that's not the bar, right?
mm.
That's a non-factor. That's just a given. No
Yeah.
one is supposed to hit you, right?
Mm,
So you have to look at other things, other red flags, other behaviors, right? Not just those things that may have been problematic in your last relationship, but a holistic picture, or you're going to end up in the same kind of relationship, just with a different set of problems. So
yeah.
I think the
Yeah.
same kind of applies to romantic relationships too.
Mm, interesting. You I'm curious because I don't have children. And this podcast is a little bit about being child free. I've spoken to a few other people who don't have kids, and I do wonder a lot if the decision to not have children stems from complicated relationships with our moms or
Mhm.
non-existent relationships. For me,
Yes.
I don't see it that way, although my sisters strongly disagree with me. They are like adamant that that is my
Yeah.
reason.
Yes.
Um, and maybe there's a little bit to that, I'm not sure. But is that another thing that you have seen happen as a result that, there's just too much fear of repeating those patterns? So you just don't.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a common one. I mean, I think it's
Hmm.
a normal reaction,
Yeah.
because they don't trust their capacity to be different, and especially if there's like generational. So if it was, great grandma, grandma, mom, like if there's
Yeah.
like a long-term pattern, I
Mm.
think that's even more scary. Like, how do I break this really kind of permanent
Yeah.
sealed cycle within our family. Um, and that's kind of, I used to think that way. I'll share that, I used to think, oh, I'm never going to have kids because I don't want to treat my kids this way. And then I thought, okay, well, if I have kids, I only want boys because I could see like my mother has a, decent relationship with my brother, but he was treated differently. So
Mm.
the
Hmm.
boys are like the golden child, in the families oftentimes. So they have a different relationship. So I'm like, I think I can do that. I think I can even do better because it won't be as emotionally draining as having a girl. And then I had two girls. And then I was like, okay, so I guess I'm gonna have to, give it my all. And, for me, it was like limiting, how many kids that we had, and trying to make sure that I could maintain my capacity to parent them at a level that I wanted to parent them, so that
Hmm.
I'm not sacrificing, let's say quantity for quality, right? Like
Yeah.
I really need to focus on these kids. I really need to focus on who I am as a mother. I have a career, so that is my capacity is
Mm.
to um so I've been at different phases of it. And I hope my girls will not be offended in knowing that I used to want boys. Because it's been great, and it's been very restorative for me to have them and to see like, oh, I can do this. We can
Mm.
have positive relationships, and watching them come into their own as young women, uh it is like it's that affirmation that the work that I did is paying off.
Mm. Hmm.
But I think that, the challenge with when we've had experienced maternal maltreatment is we don't know. Like these things are so deep in us. I think, as much work as I've done in the decades of, processing, it's like I still find these little blind spots of, I didn't realize my mother affected me
Mm.
in this pocket of my life, or I can't quite put the threads together of why, I think this way, or why I do this thing this way, or why I say this thing, and other people will point it out to me. So, I think the challenge in knowing what the source is and the why, because some people who don't have maternal maltreatment choose not to have children, so it's not a
Yeah.
you know uh something that is a thing that people shouldn't do or don't do in other circumstances. But I do think it's hard to know because it's part of your formation, right? It's like in your
Mm.
core. So the point that little, piece of memory or whatever that's driving that I don't know that it's always possible. So
Mm.
I think it's difficult to have full insights about the whys of many of the things that we do. But the big things, I do think, it's probably hard to disentangle the influence of, having toxic mothers in our lives.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You wrote in the introduction about a friend who told you that they thought that trauma is trauma if you think it is, if you
Yeah.
believe it to be,
Yeah.
and you said no.
No,
It's not true.
I don't believe that.
Um, can you explain how we know the difference? Because I'm asking because there's been a lot, of course, in the media about estrangement and
Uh-huh.
parents whose children have decided to cut off contact with them, insist that they don't know what went wrong. Everything was fine. They didn't mistreat them. But I've always been really skeptical of that because I don't think the majority of people would choose to go no contact with a parent unless, the other choice was really horrible. So,
Mhm.
can you, I know that, there's a lot of talk about trauma being overused.
Mhm.
So maybe can you explain, what's trauma, what's not trauma, and then, you know, I guess we don't need to have experienced trauma necessarily in order to choose estrangement, right?
Right. Yeah, I love that you said that. So I think about it from a psychological lens,
Hmm.
and it really needs to be events that are outside the norm. Um, not everyday occurrences. They're like sort of outliers. They, cause some sort of reaction, right? Whether it's a psychological reaction, whether it's memories or that are particularly disturbing, right? So there's a
Mm,
level of disturbance that's just not sort of everyday, like you hurt my feelings. We I think it's great that we're being more aware about how negative interactions can shape us, but that doesn't necessarily rise to the level of a traumatic experience. We're really talking about the outliers,
mm,
right? And I agree with you that a lot of times, people think that you're making these decisions casually, or this is just, it's an easy way out. But I think most people want to be in relation with their family. They dream of, of things getting better. Um, but it's sort of that ongoing, types of experiences, with the holidays coming up. I think about that a lot. It's like the anxiety about going and being back with your family because those toxic behaviors are going to be present, and that's causing distress and anxiety
mm,
and avoidance, right? So so it's not just like this um, you know basic type of bad parenting day, right? We're
mm,
talking about chronic, we're talking about intense, we're talking about outside of the norm. And that doesn't mean that different people don't respond to different things different ways. So our ability to cope, is also a part of it. So a lot of times, people may have experienced a traumatic event, but they don't sort of have an emotional or psychological reaction to those events. Um, so I think about, I mentioned that with ACEs, like divorce is a very common one. For some
mm,
people, it's like, yeah, my parents aren't together, no big deal. For other people, they really internalize it. It's my fault. If I should have done more, I should have, So the response can also vary. Um, but I think sometimes, in some cases, there is, in rare cases, this attention seeking type of experience where people will call things trauma to like get your attention, to make it sound more intense than it was.
mm,
And I see that mainly people, it's kind of the, people with personality disorder type of thing. So my mother will, for example, talk about her childhood traumas, right? But these aren't things that are verified with anyone else in the family. That no one else would call that like, oh, one time your mother didn't like a Christmas gift that you got her. That would not rise to the level
mm,
of a trauma. Like, yeah, is that hard to accept that someone didn't seem grateful? Yes, but that is not a trauma. So when people sort of elevate and exaggerate things to a place that just to make themselves the victim and need empathy and attention,
mm,
that's a different kind of person. And I think that's not accurate, to really call those things trauma. I think also it waters down for those who have really experienced trauma, like what that means. So it just kind of makes
mm.
it like, well, everybody has that, and it's like, no,
Yeah, yeah.
they don't actually. So, no, that's a really great question. I think about that a lot. And I,
Mm,
I do always want to hold space for people's negative experiences, their mistreatment, the things that bothered them, but making sure we're keeping that in an appropriate context and not elevating everything to this extreme level. And I think for
mm,
most people, they don't do that. But for some, there is that tendency to maybe over exaggerate for sympathy and whatnot.
hmm, hmm.
Yeah.
And maybe, I mean, I'm thinking again about in terms of estrangement. I wonder if people maybe choose that term in order to feel less judged for being estranged from parents, um, even if it's what they experience maybe doesn't qualify as trauma. But what
Mhm.
would I mean, as we said, you don't need to have experienced trauma
Yeah.
to be estranged and, to I think everyone should feel validated in that choice.
Yes.
So do you have parameters that you use as sort of a guide for when it's the right choice, when it's time to cut contact? And you said
Mhm.
in your book, I wanted to share this quote that we can teach people how to treat or mistreat you by what you permit in your life.
Mhm.
setting limits for what you will and will not tolerate is psychologically healthy. So,
Yeah.
how when is the right time to set those kinds of limits with a parent, do you think?
I I can't answer that definitively, but I say for
Mm,
me and my clients, what I'll say is, what are your limits?
mm-hmm,
How much can you take? How much can you tolerate? How much is this distressing you?
mm-hmm,
Um, and what is the trade-off? Because there's consequences of no contact. You lose your family, you lose maybe supports, you lose,
mm-hmm,
those emotional ties to people, whether they're healthy or not, they're still ties.
mm-hmm.
And so it's difficult, right? It's very difficult to go no contact with somebody who's basically woven into your DNA. So I think it's about individual capacity to deal with things, but recognizing that your feelings are just as valid as everyone else's, that if you feel like this is too much and I can't handle this anymore, and I've done, I think in most cases people even get to the point where it's like, I've done everything that I can to try to remediate this relationship, right? And, I mean, honestly, I don't know that you have to either. Because in my mom case, I feel like I could have saved 10 years, like just accepting it and like, I should, I knew this. I'm a whole psychologist. Like I should have done this 10 years before. But I felt like I had to do everything in my
Mm,
power to try. So it was like, it was limiting how often I went. It was limiting how long I stayed. It was saying, hey, if this continues, I'm going to leave. But I had the privilege of doing that. I didn't really need my family in the same way as, for example, my sister. She had children young, so she couldn't really disown our mother when you need a babysitter, right?
mm-hmm.
When you need maybe a place to stay from time to time, in other cases. Like it for her it took her a little bit longer to come to that place, um because she needed the family in a way that I didn't. I had the privilege to be able to say, I can walk
Mm-hmm.
away and I will be all right. My family, we can stand alone on our own. So I want to acknowledge that that's not necessarily even possible for some people. Like they still
Yeah,
need financial support, and other types of support that help sustain them. So it is
yeah,
a little bit of a privilege to say no contact. So I'm never one to over encourage, whatever the
mm-hmm.
action is. It's just they're like, let's weigh it out. What does it look like to go no contact with your family? What does
Mm-hmm.
it look like to stay in relation with them? And I don't think people can even really imagine. I think that's the part for me that was difficult, is that I did not think about how hard it would be. It was just a decision I made in that moment that I was done. Like, it
Mm-hmm.
was like the
Yeah,
comment, and it was like, wasn't even a big deal what happened. It was just like, that's it. I'm done. I didn't think about what does that mean to block someone, to not answer their
mm,
calls, to send their gifts back, to ensure they don't write you letters, to make sure your family doesn't tell them things about you. Like, it was a process of even training my family that probably took, I'll say, I'm gonna say 7 years for them to really understand. Like when I say no contact, I mean I don't want to know anything. Do not tell
mm-hmm.
me anything.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it just had to be extreme, because any tiny connection, it would draw me back into the chaos, and
Mm-hmm.
I wanted no parts. So for me, it had to be like, when I say no contact, I mean I don't even want vicarious contact.
Yeah, yeah,
But for some people, that's not really possible. They want to know. They want to know, what's going on. Still remotely, they may have hands out there. So there's levels to it, I think. Um, and people have to really decide for themselves, like, what is this? Is this distressing me? And I think this is a good time of year to really think about that. I used to dread,
mm-hmm.
like, okay, where are we going? How long are we staying? When are we leaving? Who's
Mm-hmm.
going to be there that can be my human buffers,
Mm-hmm.
right? You see you're talking to me. Can I move over here? I'm going to go to the other room. I'm going to eat my Thanksgiving dinner in the other room. Like, just really having all these strategies. And for me, it just didn't work. So, hopefully for other people, there are like the buffers can help, the boundaries can help. They can, make things a little bit
Yeah.
easier. It doesn't need to go necessarily to the extreme. Um, but I think it's like accepting that, there's no shame in that, and you have to do what you have to do to take care of your own mental health, like whatever that looks like for you, and that is valid.
Um, Thank you. I realized after I asked that question that this next one is going to sound like a trap, but it wasn't.
Okay.
Um, no, the other thing that we often hear about from parents who have children who have cut off contact is that their therapist told them to do it.
Mm,
And again, I've always been skeptical because that's never been my experience. I've
yeah.
never had someone who is estranged tell me that their therapist advised it. Um, and as you just said, you recommend what's right for you. What can
Yes.
you manage, right? So it's extremely individual. And you didn't say that, there are any hard and fast rules, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
um, I don't know if you can help with this, but where do you think that idea comes from that people become convinced that their children are just following advice of a therapist or a psychologist?
Well, they have to have someone to blame that is not
Mm,
them. They have
yeah.
to be someone
Yeah.
else is the cause of this behavior and not them. I think parents will oftentimes feel threatened when a child goes to therapy because they do feel like blamed and shamed, for their behaviors rising to the level of being a catalyst for their children to seek therapy. So I think it's a lot of like just trying to saving face. Um, I don't think any therapist worth their salt is telling people what to do. Like that's just not what we're trained
Mm,
to
right.
do. We are here to, help people think about, what this means for their life and what their options look like and, how they can implement, changes for themselves. They're the ones that have to live with it, right? So,
Mm,
you know, I wouldn't think that is a real thing people say. I think it's a convenient scapegoat for, deflecting from the ownership of no, you caused your child to estrange from
mm,
you. It wasn't the therapist. The therapist may have brought some things to light. They have may pointed out some patterns. They may have talked about solutions, right? Brainstorm like
mm,
this is what, these are the things like have you, it sounds like you thought about this. What, just presenting a menu but to advise, I don't think any therapist would do that unless there was an imminent threat to the
mm,
client. So
mm,
I do think that that is more of a, either a scapegoat from the parent, and I'm like, maybe in a rare case, the child was like, my therapist told me, and then I think it's probably a misunderstanding. So I don't think
mm,
that's a real phenomenon that is happening on a wide scale. That
mm,
is really something that people have to worry about as far as going to therapy because we understand how difficult it is. It sounds like easy, like no contact, but it's really, really, it's not like intimate partner relationship where you can just block them. Like it's your family. So you have other
yeah.
people that are connected to them. It's really, really a difficult process. And so
Mm.
I don't think anybody would take that lightly and casually. And
When you decided to cut off contact with your mother for good, you wrote in your book, I cried one last good cry, a cry of grief. I grieved the loss of a mother I never had and would never be. The seasons of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance ended. I forgave her eventually, but I had to love her from afar. It was the only way to honor my mother, which is beautiful, and very moving. I was intrigued by what you say about it's the only way to honor my mother. And I wondered, for me, when I read it, I related a lot to what you wrote. For me, I thought that maybe that by cutting off contact, it was a way to sort of preserve something before it got even worse.
Mhm.
Is that what you mean by honoring
Yeah,
her, or is there something else to it?
yeah. I think it was like you said, yes, like it was a sense of like I if anything else happens, if any more happens, like I can't even preserve any part of love or affinity for her, like empathy or anything.
Mm,
Um and I think it's like this radical acceptance. Like I can love her because this is who she is completely. I accept it. I'm no longer going to try to change her. I am no longer going to expect more of her. I fully um, in a way, when I say love, I like embrace who she is, that doesn't mean you can be a part of my life, but I can honor you as a person who brought me into this world, who kept me alive, and at the same time, not be in relation with you.
Mm,
Um, and that keeps it gets me off that cycle of of drama and reconciliation and forgiveness and starting over.
mm,
um it just removes me from that completely, because it's just like, how low can we go in this experience, like, so it allows me to retain those fragments of, this is not this person does have some positive qualities, right? This person did play a part in who I am, and honoring that. But the
mm,
rest, the abuse, the all the things I reject, and
mm,
those I cannot have as a part of my life.
mhm,
So
mhm,
very difficult, but and I think for me, like, there's probably a little bit of a religious connotation under there too, because that's part of one of the most difficult things for me, was that, I used to be much more in a religious mindset of like, I have to, if I don't forgive her, then you can't be forgiven. Right? There's that kind
mm,
of message within the church. And so I always felt like, oh, I have to keep staying in relation with her. Um, and, at some point I had to reconcile those beliefs that, there's nothing that requires me to be, in her space and her in mine and her being my life. It keeps me from continuing to feel or act in a way that may be, from a Christian perspective, maybe seen as disrespectful, right? I
mhm,
don't have to be
mhm.
disrespectful because I have no interaction with you,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Keeps me from that. And so I just really kind of had to come to a place where, um, radical acceptance, like, none of that matters. I cannot have engage with somebody like that for my own mental health, and that has to be my priority for my children,
Mhm,
um and my spouse, and really letting go of this ideal that things could get better, that she could get better, and
mm,
just be
mhm.
resolved that, yeah, this is who
This is
she is,
how it
this
is,
is what she
yeah.
is. Yeah.
And I guess that distance, um, allows the space to forgive, right? Because if you're
Mhm,
in the conflict all the time,
mhm.
y you can't keep up really, but
Can't.
I felt that in recent years, having that distance and perspective from my mom.
Mhm,
I mean, we've been estranged for 20 years, and I feel like it's
mhm,
only in the last 5 years. I haven't been angry all that time, but in the last 5 years, I've been able to see and remember good things
mhm,
that I can take away from the relationship we had and like the things that
yeah,
she taught me. And I don't feel like anger or resentment toward her, and I wish her well. And but I just, with the awareness that we can't have a relationship. And I
mhm,
guess that only comes in with distance or,
mhm.
some kind of miracle reconciliation. But yeah,
But I think that's the part we have to stop hoping for, and I think for me,
yeah.
that was the thing. It was just like, this is who she is, and I think even after we went no contact, it would be, I remember, like, maybe, 4 years in, like, something happened, and it was just like a tip it wasn't even like it was just a tiptoe, like, and I was just sucked into this whirlwind of
Mm,
being the, scapegoat in a situation that had nothing to do with either of us. It was just fascinating to watch her thread me into this villain role
mm,
in something that had nothing to do with me. And I was like, it just confirmed, like, yes, this is who she is years later,
yeah.
fully and radically accepting it. I think one of my challenges was that for my family to get on board with fully accepting that that is who she, and I think they do surface level, but not really. I think one, until she harmed them herself. Like,
Yeah.
there was like, I remember she had a situation with her brother, one of my uncles, and she's like, I'm done. That's it. I'm never speaking to her again. my sister pointed out to him, it's so interesting that she did one thing to you and you're ready to go no contact, but you all pressured us for 20 years to stay in
Mm,
relation with her when she did all of these things to us for our entire lives.
yeah.
And he was like, "You're right. And I'm sorry." He's like, "I will never do
Mm,
that again. I will never pressure you to be in
mm,
relation with her ever again." And so he finally got it in that moment because
mm,
he experienced it and was able to frame it in a way that, um, where it's like, wow, like, yeah, we have been really pressuring you guys to push you back into relation with
yeah.
your mother, and that really wasn't fair. That
Yeah.
we a lot of times they would say, "Oh, that was in childhood, you need to get over it." And it's like, no, she is still actively doing
Yeah.
these things that are problematic. And I think, like I said, until they became a victim or they, really, I think, realized my resolve in it, that they stopped trying to, make it happen, stopped trying to, orchestrate meetings and
Mm,
things like that. And, it took a long time even for them to accept it. So
mm,
it wasn't just me that had
yeah.
to work through, what this would look like.
You write about how, particularly in Black communities, it's common to you're taught not to air your dirty laundry. So, talking about dysfunctional families and abusive parents is not something that happens. And I think, like, even more generally, that is, at least with estrangement, it's still sort of a taboo thing
Taboo.
that it's it's
Yeah.
it's getting better.
Hmm.
Um, and I think your book helps with that. Lots of other memoirs recently I've read have addressed it. So, do you think the tide is turning at all in this regard?
I do, and I'm so proud of us. I was just talking about this past weekend with some girlfriends who kind of have challenging relationships with their mother, and we're sort of thinking like, what is with that generation,
Mm,
And I said we're always quick to give a pass, and people will, like, dismiss your, experiences with your mother, like, well, she did her best, and that drives me batty. 'Cause I'm like, I don't feel like they did. Like, I feel like you didn't. Let's be clear. But I think this generation, I'm watching my friends in this generation really do their best, right? Like
mm,
recognizing, oh, yeah, I had them young. I wasn't the most mature mom, and now I'm growing, and maybe, the lingering effects, and, that they are really putting in the work to try to have more emotionally mature relationships with their children in a way that is just it's it's inspiring. Like I do feel like the tide is turning. I do think, there is we're getting less reluctant, and I've seen that over the years, like less reluctant to talk about our stories. I know people always chastise me, but that's your mother, or that, you only have a mother, or my
mm,
mother died, so how dare you still have a mother on this earth. Like, it was all sorts of, projections that people would have on, what I should do and how I should be in relation to my mother, not really ever fully hearing my story or stepping into my shoes
mm,
for a moment to sit with the discomfort that a mother could behave this way. And so more recently, I've listened to my friends engaged in this dialogue and actually sit with what their mother has done without going into what I call rescue mode. Like, well, but she took care of me, she raised me, and she fed me, and she,
mhm, mhm,
without doing that. And so I do think the tide is shifting. Um, I hope for on a grand scale, but I think we're the generation going to therapy. We're the generation trying to do better for our kids. And I would say this generation really is trying to do the best with what they have, right?
mm,
Um, but I think it was also possible in generations before. Like my grandmother, she went through a similar, like, horrific childhood. She really turned her life around with a, 10th grade education in
mm.
her faith. That's what she used to
Wow.
say. My kids will not experience substance use, and they will not feel unsupported. They will not, be,
Mhm,
in a dysfunctional household. And she really put in everything she could. People will say like, "Oh, you guys are just educated, and that's why you can do this." And I'm like, It's not that. It's not
mm,
poverty that causes you to abuse and neglect your kid. Now that can be stressful, and that can limit your capacity to be compassionate, and you're tired and you have extra stressors. I get that. But my grandmother, they still working class
Mm-hmm.
household, all those things that were similar sort of circumstances um, that she protected her kids from what she had experienced and what my
Mm-hmm.
grandfather had experienced in childhood. So I don't know that I don't really agree with the idea that they did their best, but I do see this generation really, really reflecting and working hard and sitting in the discomfort and challenging it a little bit more and not being so quick to just dismiss the damage that's being done, but
Yeah.
really, sit with it, address it, and at least talk about it. Even if the mothers aren't receptive, they're like, I just even approach them to talk about it is
Mm-hmm.
like is a big step
Yeah.
for folks. So I really do hope it's a shift that is becomes widespread and becomes the norm.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much. That was brilliant conversation. I really appreciate your perspective on all of this and the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me. I've listened to your show and, I think it's such a great platform to have these very difficult conversations. And wish you all the best in what you're doing to try to help other people that are dealing with similar things.
Thank you. And your book is Dishonor Thy Mother, available now through, you said Wiley Publisher, right?
Wiley Publishing, it's available right now, it's shipping, and it's also available on Amazon.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bad Mothers is written, produced, and edited by me, Monica Cardenas. I'd love it if you'd rate and review the show and get in touch with any feedback. You can find me on my Substack, and guess what? It's called Bad Mothers too.